wrote an article a couple of years ago where it came across a 2002 Mecca Declaration from, I believe, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where they described jihad against Israel as indeed a defensive war and an obligatory duty. That was, of course, precisely at the time of the Second Intifada. And that, along with the celebration of terrorists and suicide bombers among the Palestinians and groups, the Palestinian Authority, the pay-to-slave program, Hamas, etc. I don't see there in the Palestinian society or the wider Islamic world any denunciation of such terrorist tactics.
Yeah. Well, a few points there. First of all, if you want to identify people who are okay with suicide bombing, I mean, I can give you a list. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, we could go through a list. But my point is that the bulk, actually, the majority, have come out against suicide bombing. And actually, you mentioned Mecca. The Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, and we can get into motivations, but he actually condemned suicide terrorism before 9/11. And this was reported by a think tank right here in DC a few months before the 9/11 attacks. Now, in my book, I discuss a debate between Yusuf al-Qaradawi and the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, bin Baz, in the mid-90s, over whether the Palestinians should make peace with Israel. And since you mentioned Saudi Arabia, I'll just mention that in this case, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia was actually arguing that they should make peace with Israel. His reasoning was kind of problematic. His reasoning was that the Palestinians are weak. So actually, his reasoning was problematic, to my mind. But in any case, so I guess I would just say, let's look at the whole picture. And I'm happy. And in the book, I provide numerous examples of people. It was actually at one point I'm quoting these condemnations. I'm thinking, is this too much? No, I should keep going, because there's not enough awareness actually of what's out there. Yes.
Sorry if I took someone else's turn. It's really interesting when some of my students are going to see this later in the semester, but bin Laden's, I forget if it was the 1996 justification declaration of war against the U.S. or the later post 9/11 declaration, but he says, you kind of mentioned it, right, which is that he says, okay, the reason why we can kill American civilians is because American civilians vote for their leaders, and therefore they're accountable to their, which is sort of this weird, like you mentioned, kind of this like perverse democratic argument, or sort of this like mutated democratic notion of democracy. So then I was watching this documentary, The Man from Plains, Georgia, about Jimmy Carter, and after he wrote this book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, so he's facing a lot of criticism. And there's an interview with Alan Dershowitz. And the interviewer asks him, Mr. Dershowitz, why is it acceptable for the Israeli army to bomb Gaza? It's basically just bomb the cities in Gaza, which is a civilian population. And he says, they elected Hamas. Right? So they're kind of Hamas, actually. I said, this is exactly the same argument bin Laden used, right? So what's interesting is that, I guess it's more a comment than a question, but I love your thoughts on this, is that the strongest common ground, I think, between in this whole discourse is this kind of perversion of democracy, which says that democratic populations are accountable for the actions of their government, which is insane. But it's not an Islamic, or it's an argument used by numerous sides who want to justify its actions of civilians.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of collective guilt. When you go back and look at the sources, as obviously you've done many times, you see, like in the Battle of Uhud, for example, you have these, for example, women supporting Quraysh on the battlefield, and they're to be treated as they're not fighting, so they're to be treated as they're not to be harmed. So, but if we're going to, if you think about it, they're clearly supporting the army, and that's more direct support than even just voting, right? So I'm with you in finding that to be extremely troubling for many reasons. Yes,
I'm not sure what so powerfully motivates these suicide bombers. If you look at today's world, almost entirely all the violence committed by suicide bombers, Muslims against Muslims. If you look at Afghanistan, the last 3, 4, 5 months, hundreds of Muslims Afghans have been killed by suicide bombers. So if you look in Yemen, that's what's happening there. Look in Nigeria, Boko Haram, all against Muslims. What motivates these people so powerfully?
Yes.
They're not even against Israel or America.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and of course, the largest group of victims has been Muslims. There are many factors, but I think this is why I'm very careful to say we should not dismiss the religious motivation. There is a religious motivation. It's just not the religion it's not the Islam that I follow, or it's not my Islam. It's not the Islam of the vast majority of Muslims, but there is clearly a belief that's pushing some of these people. Now, that doesn't mean that they've studied the religion carefully, or I mean, you get these anecdotes about somebody with Islam for Dummies, whatever. In some cases, they've studied more than others. The point is that I think there is a belief dimension. So the belief is that these other Muslims are not real Muslims, and they're actually the enemy, and to have honor before God. And keep in mind, there are multiple factors. So it's not just that religious dimension. There's also angst, feelings of angst. And I think we have to account for angst anytime we talk about terrorism. Why is there angst? What exactly are they feeling? So I would leave it at that. I'm not a terrorism specialist, so I would leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm curious about the kind of genealogy behind these false interpretations.
Yes.
So when he cites, the four scholars, and he just kind of has this generic knowledge of what they said, and of course it's a misrepresentation.
Yeah.
But can you talk about where that comes from, or sort of how it becomes popularized in a certain kind of public imagination?
Without having carefully studied the genealogy, my impression, I'll just give you my impression, is that it's kind of like the game telephone in a kind of a crude way, where they say, a scholar says, okay, well, we're not supposed to use fire, but if the enemy uses fire, we can use fire. And then that becomes, well, if they kill our innocents, we can kill their innocents, even though they might explicitly say you can't do that. And that would be my assumption. I don't know if Professor Brown, if you've seen anything on this as well.
I mean, I don't know. I don't like the kind of lazy argument that sort of Salafism is like a conveyor belt to jihadism or something. I don't think that's true. I think that's been borne out. I think that's been demonstrated as well. But when you look at the citations they go through, so like Shawkani, and like a lot of times they're going through hadith commentaries. So they go through hadith commentaries, and then they go through like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. So these are sort of prime Salafi sources. And then it's not a coincidence that, the madhab traditions, the kind of non-Salafi Jewish traditions tend to be pretty uniformly opposed to this line of thinking. And also, some Salafis who are, sometimes they're called, what's the word, quietists or maybe kind of intellectual Salafis, right? That they categorically condemn suicide bombing, but not because what we would see as like some kind of moral sensitivity they have, but simply because they categorically condemn suicide. So there's no, even if they were to say that you could like kill these people or those people, they would say you could never kill yourself. So you find like different, I think a lot of it comes through like a really Salafi reading of some of these texts. That's not to criticize Salafism or condemn it, just a fact, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. I mean, and actually, I mean, if you look at it, some of the most outspoken critics of suicide bombings have also come from people from the same method, from the Salafi approach.
Like Albani was a huge critic of suicide bombing.
There's a guy I really like called R.J. Lifton, and he wrote a lot about extreme states of mind and apocalyptic mindedness. He was talking about fanatics and fanatical causes, cults, for example. Well, that's a lot of Lifton's work. And in kind of an apocalyptic mindedness, because the time has altered, and this is the end time, and that which you were bound by in other times, you are no longer bound by in this time because of the specialness of the time. You are called to go over and beyond the conventions because this is God's call if you have the courage.
Yes. Yeah. And certainly you see that in ISIS writings. Very apocalyptic. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I found it very interesting. But I thought, I haven't read the book yet, and I look forward to reading it. But say from a comparative perspective, if we look at, say, the rise of Buddhist extremists, nationalist radicalism in places like Burma today, with its attacks on the Rohingya, if we place it within, the context of what's happening in the nation, one understands the deep-seated grievances, sense of fear, sense of apocalyptic mindset, existentialist fear for a whole range of reasons, social, economic, historical, and so on. Sri Lanka, for example, here again, another example of Buddhist extremism. In those countries, the victims tend to be Muslims, and in India with, say, the rise of Hindu extremism as well, and one could also look at Christian radicalism and extremism in many parts of the world, say such as the Oklahoma bomber, for example, a classic case, and the list goes on.
Yeah.
And then that kind of really strengthens your case with regard to one needs to look at this problem in a broader
Yes.
context
Right.
to fully grapple and address
Right.
the root cause.
Right. I mean, world history did not begin in the 1980s,
Yeah.
and it's not just a certain part of the world. I mean, or certain regions of the world. Absolutely, I'm with you, 100%. Yeah. Yes, I think back there, and then we'll go back there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. So from all these new atheists, and you show up some of the problems of Sam Harris's arguments, do any of them have less sloppy research and actually have useful critique compared to someone like him?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you because there's a fan back here.
And do any of the new atheists have less research errors and they're not as sloppy? In their
Okay, good question. Yeah, that's a good question. Harris had a lot to say. He's probably, I thought, the most eloquent writer that I came across of the new atheists I looked at, but had some really egregious mistakes. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you could tell she knows a thing or two more than Harris does, but still really sloppy, citing sources like, I don't know, like 10 signs, Islam is like the mafia, or actually citing these kinds of articles, like online articles that are not scholarly, as far as I can tell from my look, when I looked at those articles. And she does make some basic mistakes. Actually, Professor Brown had a good response to one of the points she makes about her claim that Muslims can't take Jews and Christians as friends. You addressed that in misquoting Muhammad, I believe. And then Dawkins, I don't think he really knows what's going on. I mean, he had a really brief section on Islam in the God Delusion. He actually did what Harris does. Harris cited the story of Zaydan, the Palestinian, would-be suicide bomber, and he shows, oh look, he just wanted to be a martyr. Dawkins cites that same story of Zaydan in the God Delusion, and then he cites another story about another Palestinian would-be suicide bomber. You go back to that article, it's the same thing. It's not just that they wanted just to be a martyr for the sake of being a martyr. There's more going on. It's a very simplistic, portrayal. So that's the way. And then you have Daniel Dennett. I looked at Dennett. His discussions of Islam are very brief, which is interesting because his father was a major scholar of Islamic studies. And then you have Christopher Hitchens. I'm sorry? Daniel Dennett.
Who was his father?
I think his name was Daniel Dennett also. Yeah. And then you have Christopher Hitchens. I looked at Christopher Hitchens as well. Christopher Hitchens, actually, you know what? I just said Harris was the most eloquent. No, Hitchens is the most eloquent. But his mistakes are, he's in some ways sloppy like Harris. And I provide a couple of examples, I think, in the book. But again, he doesn't say that much in writing. Hitchens doesn't say that much in writing about terrorism specifically. Okay, yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you see a different interaction with religion with regards to lone wolf terrorist attacks and organizational terrorist attacks. Oh, like a different interaction with religion when you have lone wolf terrorist attacks.
Lone wolf terrorist attacks.
And organizational terrorist attacks.
Yeah, that's a good question. Each terrorist case you have to look at it on its own, which is a boring academic answer. But I do think, though, sometimes the differences are not as profound as people might think. Of course, I do think it's important that we look at all factors and not just religion, right? But for example, the Orlando shooting, the nightclub shooting. You know, it was reported as this is a case of homophobia, mental illness, etc. But if you look at his own statements, there is definitely an ISIS dimension there. And he actually said, I'm doing this in retaliation for the killing of some, I forgot who, one of the ISIS leaders. But because I'm not a terrorism specialist, I'm going to stop right there.
Yeah. Yes.
I think relatedly though, the biggest problem that I see with the new atheists is not just that they mischaracterize particular religions,
Yeah.
that he's, for instance, misreading Islam. It's that they don't have any sense of how religion or religiously motivated behavior fits into the picture of broader human behavior, and that there's often not, there's immense overlap between sort of economic and structural
Absolutely.
conditions that are motivating
Absolutely.
violence in multiple places.
Absolutely.
We don't seem to be able to discern
Right.
any of that.
Right. That's why I say it's rather, it's facile. These are facile explanations. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your presentation. My question actually has to do with the first half of your title,
Yes.
The New Atheists.
Yes.
Is there anything that's particularly significant about the fact that they're atheists or self-described atheists
Yeah.
that relates to their argument?
That's a good question.
Or is it just really incidental?
Well, certainly, I mean, so they're not, one way of characterizing them is they're anti-theistic, right? So they're not just atheists. That's why I said at the beginning, some of the most vocal critics are other atheists. They're anti-theistic, and I think because of 9/11, and then terrorism in general, Islam becomes the focal point. And why did I choose to focus on the new atheists? I kind of touched on this a little bit as well, but I noticed, for example, my students, they didn't care about, like Robert Spencer, for example. They cared about Sam Harris. They were affected by Sam Harris. And that could be maybe a different experience if I'm at another university, but Michigan State and University of Illinois, it was Sam Harris that was affecting my students and the way they think about jihad and Islam, and that's why I felt compelled to look into this further. Yeah. I'm not sure who was, actually I think you were first, actually. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, by the way.
Thank you.
And when you're thinking about this idea of maybe there's a different kind of Islam, or even maybe a very unique conception of Islam for ISIS, for Al-Qaeda and these groups, how does that both relate to maybe equating them less with religious groups and more almost like a sort of national movement or a national identity, how they understand religion, but also how does that relate to Muslim arguments against them? For example, a lot of people say that, ISIS are Khawarij, and they'd say, they're outside the fold of Islam because of the various legal niceties they're essentially using, kind of mental gymnastics they're using to violate these.
Yeah, that's a great question. I always tell people this, like, if you catch me after a lecture and we're walking the hallway, I'll tell you guys, these guys have nothing to do with Islam. But as an academic, I can't say that. As an academic, they identify as Muslim, they invoke Islamic sources. I have to say they are, in my field, that's the way we're trained to deal with these things. We're not here to pass judgments, right? So that's why, Graham Wood in The Atlantic, he has that quote that ISIS is Islamic, very Islamic. I can get why he would say Islamic. They identify as Muslim, they invoke Islamic sources. What's problematic is the very Islamic part. Why are they very Islamic? Because they cite sources that you haven't studied, so it seems like they're citing it properly. Why are they very Islamic? I don't know. Okay, I think maybe here and then there, yeah.
So the Christian fundamentalist opponents of Islam, are there arguments against Islam basically similar to new atheists, and can one counter them in the same way, or just one entirely different argument?
There's certainly a lot of overlap. The idea that Islamic scripture directly explains or motivates terrorism. You'll often see these like Facebook posts with like passages from the Quran. Look at this verse. Look at this verse. As if like bin Laden read a verse from the Quran saying kill the infidel, and he went out there and he said, okay, we got to do 9/11. If that's the case, he wasted a lot of time talking about foreign policy. I mean, if you just go through all his statements, he always gets into U.S. foreign policy. Well, the U.S. did this to us, and they did that to us, and of course, his reading of geopolitical reality, we can talk about how problematic, it is, or how accurate in some cases. Of course, even by Americans will even concede some points. But the point is that it's not like this straight line, scripture to terrorism. That's a very sloppy way of approaching it, and we do see that in religiously motivated criticisms of Islam, where you like look at this verse, compare that to this verse in our scripture, and it's like, well, what about this other verse here and this verse there, and it's a lot of cherry picking. Yeah, I don't know, Zaid, were you next, or maybe in the back there?
You can go first.
Okay, Zaid.
No, I insist.
Professor Adhami, sorry.
At the time, there was. I was just kind of piggybacking on this and a couple other questions. I was just going to say, I think one interesting feature that might be different is the way in which the new atheist critics seem to also be presenting general features of religiosity that then Islam is a case of, like the worst case of,
Right.
such as like
Yes.
faith equals zealotry, faith
Yes.
equals irrationality.
Yes.
And so there's the scriptural component of like citing text, but then simply the fact that like that, faith has that kind of like zealotry and tribalism, etc., that will necessarily lead to this, whereas that might
Yes.
not be the case in arguments like Spencer, who seems to be engaging much more in like
Specifically Islam.
Specifically Islam, and actually engages Muslim tradition more. So for him, like the whole Darul Islam, Darul Harb
That's a great point.
is a very important.
That's a great point.
Like the abode of Islam and the abode of war
That's a great
distinction.
observation. Yeah.
Whereas I don't think Harris and these guys.
That's correct.
I don't know if you. Yeah.
No, I think that's an outstanding observation. I mean, Spencer will get into. He definitely likes Reliance of the Traveler, but he gets into these specific texts, and he'll quote them. I mean, and Reliance of the Traveler is never even, I don't think, mentioned in Harris or even thought about. So you're right in that regard. And then, one of Spencer's books, the title is Religion of Peace: Why Christianity is and Islam isn't. So there's a clear distinction being made. Whereas the new atheists are using Islam as the example. They're saying this is why religion is bad, and they use Islam as the prime example. Great observation.
Thanks for the entire presentation. This has been very informative. One of the areas I wanted to ask about too, you mentioned something, you compared like the Jainist fundamentalism.
Yes.
Or you were mentioning how Sam Harris did with,
Yes.
Islamic fundamentalism. But I felt like that comparison, or I guess the critique you made wasn't, it didn't fit my understanding of what he meant when he was reading, or when he was saying it.
Yes.
My understanding was that when he automatically said, oh, well, pacifism exposes people to many dangers, he wasn't necessarily saying, therefore, pacifism makes other people more vulnerable. I think he was trying to say that people who are pacifists expose themselves to the dangers of people that aren't pacifists.
Right. So the reason why I focused on this is because he is trying, the way I read him, is that he's saying that it's bad that Muslims aren't pacifists, because pacifists don't endanger anyone. You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
I know exactly. Yeah, that makes more sense. In other words, like, you can't simply say, oh, be pacifist, but then yet still it's going to expose them to certain things.
Right. And he says, I mean, this is going to threaten the rest of us if we become pacifists. Yeah.
I just wanted to have a second question, but if anyone else needs to go first. Also your critique when he stated that, this specific strain of Islam that's characterized with suicide bombings is very Islamic, and I thought that was really good that you pointed out that who's he to decide what is Islamic? Islam has been a discourse throughout the centuries. But I feel a lot of the critiques that I know throughout the presentation have been presented before, like, even since his book came out in the early mid-2000s. And I feel like some of them might be outdated because from what I've observed, his position has sort of evolved with the public discourse that's occurred since, the new atheists, have presented this. Yeah. And I know that he recognizes different strains of Islam, and that it's not the entirety of Islam, but a specific geopolitical push from part of Muhammad's message. And so my understanding is that he's more concerned with the behavioral consequences of specific beliefs that seem to be central enough to the doctrines of Islam, to where it's motivating a large enough number of people to use that at least as part of their motivation beyond geopolitical and poverty reasons for why they're doing these things.
Right. So, in his 2015 co-authored book, Islam and the Place of Tolerance or Future of Tolerance, there's also a film that they made with a similar title. You see a more mature Harris But what I argue in the book is that his central points are essentially the same. Yes, there's more nuance now. You know, he's more likely to say specific Muslims instead of just Muslims. But still, for him, Scripture, the most straightforward, honest reading of Scripture is directly related to terrorism. And that's why just a couple years ago, he was on Zakaria's show saying bin Laden is honest and straightforward. And that's why the whole thing about the terrorists being in the center, that was just a few years ago. He didn't say that in The End of Faith. He said that 2014 and then maybe 2015. I did see in the documentary that just came out, he gave it a different angle, gave it a different presentation. But if you look at how he was presented, at least in 2015 and 14, it was the people closer to the center are the ones who are actually taking Islam seriously. Like they're taking Scripture seriously. And the further you go, you get people who are just kind of cultural Muslims and so on. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I would also, take issue if he's presenting it that way. My understanding was that the whole concentric circles argument has to do with, like the smallest circle right here happens to be Muslims who are taking these specific aspects of Scripture more seriously than others.
Right, and so that's my question is, that's what my question is. So does that mean if I take Scripture seriously, I'm in the center?
No,
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Like, I think his focus was on
terrorists.
Muslims who took specific areas.
Parts of Scripture, right. But that's what I'm saying. But that's what I'm saying is that I'm not seeing that with the terrorists. Like I'm not seeing them, like I don't see them taking a certain passage of the Quran more than a scholar who's condemning them. You know what I'm saying? I think they're reading it very differently, and they're adding other elements. But I don't think it's like, oh, Surah 9 verse 29. That's why we're doing this. Yeah.
I mean, or at the very least, utilizing it more so, or utilizing it in the sense of when.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, the reason I have an issue with his concentric circles is that when you look at the description, the further out you go, these are just cultural Muslims. They don't really care about Scripture. So I take it seriously. Anyway, I don't know. And I will say he has tweaked the way he presented it in different contexts.
I would say that maybe.
Sorry.
I just wanted to kind of, from this conversation here, kind of go back to your presentation of Jessica Stern.
Yes.
Right, and the way in which she's describing how, certainly there's a need for Islamic scholars to come in and, so we can recognize that religion and religious interpretation is an element of the problem, and that part of the solution would involve Islamic scholars coming in and presenting their interpretation. But then there are all of these other factors as well. And for me, I guess the concern is that, that then sets up this dynamic of where religion comes to be seen as something that is happening outside of all of these dynamics, right? Because the ways in which you're describing the methods in which ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others interpret this rich intellectual tradition, the same thing can be described with those that are arguing against them, right? So I'm thinking about like the Marrakesh Declaration, for example, right? I mean, there's all kinds of historical fallacies that are embedded in that declaration as well. And so one can sort of take apart those arguments in a similar way.
Yes.
Because anytime you have people interpreting their tradition,
Yeah.
there's all kinds of things that you can pull on,
That's
right?
true.
And inevitably you're doing some kind of cherry picking because you
That's true.
have in mind to construct something in particular, right?
Absolutely.
And so so for me then the problem becomes that as long as we then see religion as something, or religious interpretation happening outside of all of these other factors, then the only binary that you can have at the end of the day is a good religion, bad religion binary, or a good Islam, bad
Yes.
Islam binary, which then goes back to these kinds of arguments of, well, these people are taking their scripture more seriously and these people are not, right? And then you can say, well, no, look at these scholars who are arguing against suicide bombing, but they're actually making scriptural arguments.
Yes.
But you're still, essentially what that means is that you then have, these are the good Muslims and these are the bad Muslims.
Yes.
Right? Which is essentially, I think, it's, the problem to begin with, right? That the entire framing of the problem
Yes.
is that you have Muslims, and Muslims are defined as being committed to Islam,
Right.
that then do certain things.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great observation, and I don't have a good answer, a good solution to that. What I would just say, though, is from a very practical perspective, I personally know people who just learning about, for example, this thing about the manganese. You know, you read the ISIS document and they're citing sources, and it looks impressive. But then when you actually go back to the sources, you get a different picture. So just from a practical perspective, I know people who actually like changed their minds after encountering, you know, the rest of the story. So I just know that from a practical perspective, there is something there to showing the counter argument to ISIS. Now, this does introduce the issue that you brought up, and I don't have a good solution to that. That's a good question. I don't know if others, yeah.
Well, I don't have a solution for that, but I have a comment.
Yes.
I think two things. One is on the issue of why, what's interesting about new atheists, like what's atheism about them. I think it's not a coincidence that they are also tend to be the kind of main defenders of like, you know, the West is best. They tend to be scientists, right? So if you think about the Kavanaugh book, Myth of Religious Violence, right? So people think religion causes violence, not because that's actually true, but because a modern Western conception of these issue frames it so that stuff not done by religious people is not violent. So religions cause violence because everything not done by religion is, we don't consider it violence, even though it might actually be killing people just the same. So I think and it's also not a coincidence that, you know, not to engage in sort of knee-jerk white guy bashing, but there's also this issue of misogyny in the new atheist movement. Like these guys seem to be sort of the most intense representative of this sort of white patriarchal West is best idea. And so it's not surprising that if sort of the Western conception, if in the Western view of things, religion is violent because everybody who does violence according to us is religious, right? And we don't do violence, when we do violence is not religious, right? These guys are sort of the ultimate defenders of that worldview. So religion is the ultimate problem for them because violence done by everybody else, including people like them, isn't really violent. It's not really problematic. And the second thing about the concentric circles is, and I think if I'm understanding my colleague Christine Fair's research on this correctly, people tend to, when you ask people like, you know, in Pakistan or something, what do you think about this group or that group? They'll say, oh, yeah, I support that group. And it has nothing to do with them supporting like the fact that they just killed 10 people. It has to do with they support the political objective of that group. So when you get to the question of sort of supporters or just people who are, you know, on the distant sideline waving this flag or that flag, it tends to be not a matter of I like violence or not, or I like killing civilians or not, but simply like, oh yeah, that guy really stuck it to the man, right? So, you know, good for him. And it reminds me of being in Yemen in summer 2007, and God, I wish I'd bought these things, but I don't know what happened to me when I came in the country, but they had these Osama bin Laden cigarette lighters, and you could make a flame, and then you would project, like, it would project this picture of Osama bin Laden. They also had one for Hassan Nasrallah, right? This was sort of right after the war against Lebanon, Israel 2006. And, you know, I was thinking, like, oh, well, Americans saw this, they'd be like, oh, you like Osama bin Laden, so you must be totally down with 9/11. And if you ask these people, you know, do you think it was good that 3,000 people died on 9/11? They say, of course not. But, you know, oh, so why do you support Osama bin Laden? Oh, he stuck it to the man. He really stood up against the enemy. So a lot of this sort of the support that someone like Sam Harris will point to these outside the kind of hardcore violent Muslims or these supporter groups, he sort of points to that and misreads that flag waving support as somehow a endorsement of methods or endorsement of actions, whereas it's really almost like a sympathy for this other guy who's gone and stood up against a force that you also view as problematic.
It's probably like when people say, oh, Palestinians were celebrating after 9/11, they weren't actually celebrating people dying in these towers, but they're celebrating sticking to America.
Yeah, or I don't even know if they were celebrating at all. Wasn't that just like the video of some guy's birthday or something? And
it's something that's
misrepresented. I can't remember, yeah, but I think it would be a similar type of issue.
It strikes me that while ignoring the religious content of what the people who justify violence say, you know, you can't ignore that content. But to a certain extent, what these guys are doing is essentializing Muslims as if that's the only identity you have. Where what I hear when I hear these arguments, whether it's the Buddhists in Myanmar or Sri Lanka or here, is this strong admixture of their own personal and national history.
Yeah.
It gets mixed up in that. I mean,
Well, I'll just say this. I hope I didn't cut you off.
no.
I'll just say this. I mean, you know, someone like Sam Harris, you know, he'll celebrate someone like Majid Nawaz, right? And he'll celebrate certain Muslim thinkers. But what I noticed, though, is that it's almost like, I don't know, when you look at the way he words it, it makes, I mean, you know, I haven't seen all his social media posts lately. Since finishing the book, actually, I've taken a break. But the impression I got from him and from Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Dawkins is they really like to celebrate the Muslims who would like explicitly say, I don't accept, you know, all of the Quran, for example. As if the Quran is the problem and everything else, you know. So I do want to say, to be fair to them in a sense, I do want to say they do recognize and celebrate some Muslims, but it seems to be the ones who don't take Scripture seriously.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like the argument that you hear a lot, well, so-and-so first identifies as Muslim.
Right.
Well, my mother first identified as a committed Protestant,
Yes.
committed Christian.
Yes.
You know, but that was really only one of her identities. She,
Right.
you know, why is
Right.
it problematic that a Muslim says that and not problematic that a Protestant says that?
That's right. Yeah. Oh, maybe we'll go first there and then we'll come back here. Yeah.
So someone earlier had a question. They asked about why Muslims don't denounce a lot of acts of terror or suicide bombings, when in reality it's known to be the exact opposite, especially after 9/11, but also throughout our Islamic tradition history. Why do you think that these supposedly learned people, like these new atheists, when they are making their arguments, why did they not know about all these announcements, and how can we let these announcements be made more public?
Well, it's amazing. Like, so in the book, I have this section where I show you, I talk about Sam Harris's sources, and one of them is Thomas Friedman, right? You know, big writer for the New York Times. You know, he focuses on the Middle East, and almost 4 years after 9/11, he wrote, to this day, not one Muslim cleric or scholar has condemned bin Laden, something like that. And when I just, wow. So yeah, in my book, I go through all these examples of people condemning by name, bin Laden by name, and not by name, and you know, it's just, all you gotta do is Google Muslim responses to 9/11, and what you'll see is like websites documenting all these condemnations, and you'll see some videos of people celebrating. Yeah, you'll see the two, but the point is you'll see a bunch of websites with like long lists of, and it's not even like the full, like the full list. But I will say this: part of the problem too, though, is Muslims. It's not like there's like the Pope for Muslims, right? So that I think also makes it a little bit challenging to get the word out sometimes. But part of the problem too is people don't take the time to also see what Muslims are saying. It's a two-way road, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Again, this is more generic, but I wonder if in our times we're really afraid of religious passion.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to make a funny comparison because I think some political movements, you could take communism, you could take fascism. It has a religious quality to it,
Yes.
not scripture.
Yes.
The passion is the same for one group who's an avid believer in one or an avid believer in another. So it's the capacity to believe in something so fully and passionately that it might take you over the ordinary boundaries of things.
Yes.
Now, in a religion itself, there's some people who try to contain that passion with logic, reason, rational argument.
Yeah.
But when we're dealing with situations like this, it's almost like the reason comes afterwards
Right.
and rationalizes it. But the passion is what's attractive, and I think what frightens people is, I've been walking around half dead, and I'm beginning to feel some passion with this action. I don't like it because I shouldn't like it, and I really do like it. It liberates something in me. So you see in 9/11, and there's a visceral kind of feeling that might come for it, depending on your political affiliation, etc.
Yes.
And so I think when that genie comes out of the bottle, which is passion, whether it's in a political or religious,
Yes.
it scares the hell out of our rationalistic thinking, our Western secular thinking, and many of us who just kind of hold on to the railings as we see this thing going up like a rocket.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. The one thing I will just say is that I would just hope that we'd also recognize the other side of that, right? I'll share a personal side, a personal anecdote here. I mean, for me, I was born and raised into a Muslim family. Mother has a degree in Islamic studies. Father was the president of the mosque. And I went to Egypt every summer. For me, religion was always what held me back from being violent. I've never cursed another human being, at least not since puberty. That's on film, huh? Okay, so so I would just hope that people also recognize the other side of that, which is that for me, religion always held me back and made me less violent.
They can be very similar in passions. I know
That's
like
right.
Quakers,
Yeah.
and they may be passionate to risk themselves in some nonviolent action.
This is true. This is true.
But it's still that passion which carries
Yeah.
you over your fear.
That's exactly true. Yeah.
And I think it's an ongoing quantity.
Yes. No, I hear you. That's a valid point. Absolutely. Yes.
Do you feel that perhaps unawareness or a lack of a conversation on religion in general may be fueling some of those who are more apt to want to hear and listen to and really rally around these new atheists? That maybe religion itself is not as much in conversation other than when the news picks up on something bad that happens in a religion. Do you think religious education or maybe a focus on trying to create more awareness around a religion in general could perhaps be a good contest to the rhetoric put out by these new atheists?
Yeah, I mean, I will say this. When you look at tests like, atheists and Christians and Jews, they do like religious knowledge tests. Atheists actually do pretty well on those tests, from what I've seen. But what I would wonder, though, and some of the most outspoken, supporters of Muslims actually could be atheists, right? But what I would wonder, though, in the case of the new atheists, like, what are they hearing about Islam? Like, they know about the 5 pillars, they know all these basic facts, great. But when it comes to, let's say, the rules of war, what are they hearing? That's what I would wonder. So nuance is critical, but I'll agree with you. I mean, we need to increase religious literacy. Without a doubt. I just would hope that people take the time to go beyond certain websites and certain people who maybe can't even access primary sources, who are now presented as these great scholars of Islam. But that takes effort, and that's not easy.
Yeah, I would almost say that the way that educating on world religions is handled is almost part of the problem.
Yeah.
There's an over-focus on beliefs,
right.
And beliefs translated as things that...
The 5 this, or the 4 this, or yeah.
And not enough talk about the way that there are certain self-understandings or understandings of relationships that are just so implicit and embedded and become habitual in everyday life and things like that. And so I have mixed feelings about whether more focus on religious literacy would help.
Interesting.
Back to the jihadi mindset,
yes.
The focus of your presentation. The focus was tended to be September 11 onwards, and trying to explain bin Laden and his ilk.
Yeah. Could I? Yeah.
Theological justification. Sorry.
No, I just have to jump in and just make a point.
Yeah.
I'm obsessed with 9/11 in a dark way, in the sense that it really devastated me. I was in dental school when 9/11 happened. I should have been a dentist. 9/11 is the reason I'm here today. So anyway, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think it affected all of us in different ways.
Yes.
When it happened, I was in Australia.
Wow.
And it's still with us, that shadow, that horrible shadow. But with regard to bin Laden, this is he's got a really checkered trajectory. You question his theological credentials or his understanding, his depth of knowledge of Islam as well. But we look at the man in terms of his militaristic strategies and his allies and his foes. It's very checkered. If we go back to history, he was colluding with the CIA in Afghanistan.
So
when they were fighting against the Russians. It was a nationalist struggle for some, but it was okay for him to work with the West.
Well, I'll say this. I sorry to interrupt you again. I do have to say it quickly. So he was working with the United States, but there's no evidence that he was working with the CIA.
Well,
he was on the same side, but he may have been, but there was no evidence. I just wanted to clarify.
Well,
yeah.
we minority literature,
Yeah.
you know, they were basically aware
Yeah, that
where
could
the
be,
funding was from, the arms, and so on.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a checkered
Yes.
relationship.
Yes.
And theology is, as we've noted, very cherry picking.
Yes.
Based on their stance at a particular time. And so this is what these people are all about. And then he turns against the Saudi regime when it has American troops, you know, in the Holy Land. And then the focus was on the regime. But you know, if we look at the number of the hijackers, those that engaged in 9/11, you know, most of them were from Saudi Arabia. We have to, and why is that so? You know, I think we can't deny there's a type of Islam coming out of Saudi Arabia, which is quite different from the Islam in most parts of the Muslim world. Some people refer to it as a kind of Wahhabi strain of Salafi Islam, an extremist form of Salafism, where till this day they're chopping heads and chopping limbs and whipping people and engaging in murder in other parts of the world, Khashoggi, and yet it's okay for the West and Donald Trump to be in a close relationship with such a regime. And this is, I think, what you know, fuels the cynicism of many in the Muslim world, that kind of double standards, you know, of countries in the West that ostensibly espouse human rights, democracy, and so on. I mean, back to some of the points we made earlier on.
Yes. You know, I mean, I guess the only thing I would just say is, you know, I would be very careful though that we not say that, you know, 9/11 was, like we draw a straight line from Wahhabism to 9/11. Even if we have criticisms about Wahhabism, you know, I would just say let's be careful. It would be like a specific interpretation maybe, because the reason I want to be careful is because, again, some of the most outspoken critics of 9/11 were actually Wahhabi scholars. So I would just want to be a little bit careful, which again, we can criticize it and critique it, but I just want to be careful with that point. But yeah, maybe that we'll go here then. Oh, okay, yes.
I just had a quick question about, from when you were following Sam Harris and Dawkins and others, what was their sort of relationship to the rise of the religious right in the U.S., and particularly the kind of political power that they've garnered? Because part of me, you know, thinks that they have this kind of secularist mindset that Kavanaugh and others criticize, right, where any kind of violence that is religiously motivated is a problem, right? So there's a kind of way in which secularly motivated violence or nationalistic violence is somehow legitimate, but or religiously motivated violence is more violent and more dangerous. And so as long as religion has any kind of motivation for people, right, in their response to the problem. But then part of me is also wondering if there's very much a kind of an Islamophobia that is built into you know, their response in how they focus in on Islam as a case study. So I'm thinking of Dawkins' tweet, right, where he talks about hearing the church bells and how, you know, that for him is aesthetically pleasing. So there's a different affective relationship with symbols that are associated with Christianity as opposed to the terror of the Allahu Akbar. So I was wondering, like, you know, what is their kind of relationship to the rise of the religious right and its political power? Like, is there a similar kind of response?
Yes. Well, first, let me just say you're mentioning Dawkins' tweet reminded me of his tweet criticizing Islam and the Quran, and then also clarifying that he's never read the Quran cover to cover, but he can still criticize it because I don't have to read Mein Kampf to know that Hitler was bad. But the thing is that no one's going to accuse Hitler of misinterpreting Mein Kampf. Anyway, but going back to your question, yeah, I would say of the new atheists, not so much Sam Harris, but maybe more Ayaan Hirsi Ali, because actually in her book, I think it was Nomad, she was encouraging Muslims to become Christian. Then she moved away from that in a subsequent book. So yeah, you did see some overlap with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and some, you know, far-right religiously affiliated critics of Islam. Definitely not with Hitchens. Didn't see that with Dennett or Dawkins or Harris. Just with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, really.
But you did talk about being concerned about the rise of right, like Christianity in the U.S. and political power, right? Like, I mean, in the way that I think, you know, like some liberals, for example, right, might see that as the problem of why religion should not be in the public sphere.
Definitely Harris. Definitely Harris. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, not as much. I mean, she is with some far right think tanks, so not as much. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.